خوشه یار دل ما حسینه ترانه ای که عقل از سر من پریده و دیوونگی جا گرفته عقل از سر من پریده و حرف اگه داری با خدا بزن هرکی عاشقه بگه منم یه روز عاقل بودم ز شهر عقل و عاقلا یک بار بیرونم کرد یا زینب هرکی عاقل غمی داره روزگار در همی داره عاشق نشدی نمیدونی دیوونگی عالمی داره بهشت من حسینه بود سرشت من حسینه نوشته یه کتاب سر نوشته من حسینه آخرین بیت دل من از روز ازل اسیر یک نگاه حسین و دوست داره مگه خاطر خواهی خراب و مست گوشه میخونه حسینم میخونه حسینم
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين ولا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين وحجته في العالمين واللعن الدائم على أعدائهم من الآن إلى أبد الآبدين فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أم لهم شركاء شرعوا لهم من الدين ما لم يأذن به الله ولولا كلمة الفصل لقضي بينهم وإن الظالمين لهم عذاب أليم صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم الشريف. I extend to you my greetings of peace and I pray to the Almighty that may He grant you success and well-being in this life and may He adorn our hearts with the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam and may He give us the ability and the fortune to devote our lives to following the good words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam and to take them as our imams, as our role models, and to advance their cause and to enjoin humanity to this bright and this divine path of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. There is a very important discussion relevant to the topic of Taqlid, likewise relevant to the topic of Wilayat al-Faqih. And that is the claim of mujtahids that they are the narrators of hadith. And at this juncture, I like to address that assertion, this claim, that several individuals that you, amongst the mujtahideen, and this theme you would commonly find in the speeches of all the religious speakers in the Shia realm who want to promote marji'iyya. You will find this tenor and their arguments that mujtahideen are narrators of hadith. Jurists are the narrators of ahadith, narrators of the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And because narrators of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam have grand status in the hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, thus if it is proved, if it's assumed that the jurists are indeed narrators of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, it follows that they enjoy those grand statures and the lofty position that's reserved for the narrators of hadith. However, this is far from the truth. This claim this assertion that a jurist is a narrator of hadith. The jurist is the narrator of hadith. First of all, al-mujtahid, jurist in Arabic, the term in Arabic and jurisprudence, the term for that is al-mujtahid. The jurist, the term jurist, the term al-mujtahid is not equivalent to the term narrator. And they have two different meanings, just like as a baker and an ironsmith, they have two different meanings. Likewise, here, the term mujtahid and the term rawi, al-muhaddith, narrator, there are two different distinct meanings, and that could not be hidden from you. So as far as the notion is concerned, the meaning of the two words are concerned, the concept of a narrator of hadith and the concept of a jurist, a person who issues verdicts, who issues fatwas, and as far as the notions, the conceptions, the ideas are concerned, there are two different ideas. Just as a pen and a book, there are two different ideas, two different notions. They refer to two different meanings, right? A pen and a book. Likewise, a news anchor and a newspaper columnist. These are two different meanings. They do not mean the same. So rawi means a person who is narrating the hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And a mujtahid, a mufti, a marja is a person who issues fatwa, issues verdicts in the light of many sets of proofs. One of them is hadith. The other sets of proofs include the Noble Quran, his own aql, his own rationalization for his verdicts, and any other source that he may have, such as consensus. So they are not the same. Likewise, the process of narration of hadith and the process of issuing fatwa are not the same, and that is very clear, and that is very evident. When I narrate a hadith to you, what do? I open a book and I recite a hadith, and you hear that. That is narration of a hadith. Or I write a passage and I narrate one hadith or more in that passage. Thus, I have narrated a hadith. When I issue a fatwa or another person issues a fatwa, what does that process encompass? That is a process that this person is expressing his thought. This jurist or any given jurist has reached a conclusion. He has made his inferences. He has engaged in cogitation and thinking, and he is deduced, considering the various evidence that he has in form of perhaps hadith or not hadith, in the form of the verses of Quran or not verses of the Quran, in the form of rational arguments or any other method. He considers the evidence before him, and then he reaches a conclusion. And then he expresses that conclusion. That is called issuing fatwa or issuing his verdict. He is expressing his legal, his juristic position on a certain topic. That is fatwa. So there are two different and two distinct processes. Narration of hadith is that you quote another person, that you quote another entity, and that entity happens to be an infallible and divinely appointed individual, an apostle or an imam, alayhim salam. That is narrating a hadith. So you are quoting somebody else. And ifta, issuing a fatwa, is that you're not quoting anyone. You are merely expressing your own opinion. You are merely expressing your own position, your own sentiment with regard to a topic that is given to you. So there are two different processes. The letter from the Holy Imam alayhi salatu wassalam that I engaged in its discussion in the 16th lecture on the topic of taqlid, وَأَمَّا الْحَوَادِثُ الْوَاقِعَةِ, as far as the incidents that will happen or have occurred or are happening now. As far as these incidents are concerned, فَارْجِعُوا فِيهَا إِلَى رُوَاةِ حَدِيثِنَا. And these incidents pertinent to these events refer to the narrators of our hadith. So narrators of hadith, who are they? And at that time when this hadith was transmitted, as I mentioned time and again to you, and I repeatedly explained and I showed you several acknowledgements and admissions and references from the books of very respected mujtahideen, that at that time there was no ijtihad within the Shia realm. There was no jurisprudence in the Shia realm. And at that time, Shias practiced according to a hadith. And there were many, many narrators of hadith, and many of whom were leaders and prominent individuals in narration of hadith. And these were people who had expertise in narration of hadith. So when we are looking at narrators of hadith at the peak of their coterie, at the peak of the pyramid, you see individuals who have greater mastery in narration of hadith. These are individuals who specialize in understanding hadith and distinguishing between various hadith in terms of if a hadith is weak, unreliable, and hadith that are truly transmitted by the holy imams alayhim assalam. If a hadith contains a figurative speech versus literal speech. If a hadith contains hints and allusions that imply something that is not necessarily the verbatim meaning of hadith, they would understand such wordings of the holy imams alayhim assalam. And if a hadith was spoken under the conditions of duress and conditions of taqiyya, they would understand such conditions. So there were these individuals, masters of hadith, and it was their job, it was their profession, rather it was their mastery of narrating hadith, writing books of hadith, and teaching books of hadith. So that is a muhaddith. Literally, a muhaddith means a person who narrates hadith, but not all narrators are of the same level. When you go to the highest level of muhaddithin, they are individuals who have immense knowledge, who have a wide range of expertise in various fields of hadith, and that is their mastery. Now, when we come to ijtihad takes many years. Jurisprudence takes many years, and you have to master the opinions and theories of various other mujtahideen. And you, as mujtahideen say, there are many prerequisites that you have to master in order to become a mujtahid. And all of that is not necessary for narration of hadith. So there are two different distinct fields. Now, it is important to understand that there are two distinct things. The holy Imam alayhi salatu wassalam, the holy Imams alayhim assalam, they have praised and they have venerated and they have expressed good words with regard to individuals who narrate hadith, who teach hadith, who propagate hadith. And mujtahideen have no right to claim the position of narrators of hadith, because that is not, those words have not come with regard to them from the holy Imams alayhim assalam. Those words of praise have not been expressed with regard to them. If the holy Imams alayhim assalatu wasalam wanted to praise jurists, they could have done that. Rather, inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala, if you have watched my speeches in Arabic and Farsi that I've delivered on the topic of ijtihad, what is ijtihad? And what was the position of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim assalam vis-a-vis ijtihad? You would have great amount of evidence, and I've presented inordinate amount of evidence from Shia sources that Ahlul Bayt alayhim assalatu wassalam did not condone ijtihad. Rather, they rebuked ijtihad. So these are two different areas, two different fields. One field is frowned upon as ijtihad, and one field is promoted, and that is narration of hadith. Now, even if somebody questions that the holy Imams alayhimus salatu wasalam have indeed rebuked ijtihad or not, and because I've not produced that evidence to you in English, you have a right not to agree with me, and you have a right to not to agree with me on any topic that you do not find me convincing, and you do not find my arguments persuasive. However, this much is evident that narration of hadith is different than issuing a fatwa, and they are not the same. Narrating a hadith means you quote another noble entity. Issuing a fatwa is expression of your opinion. Now, this opinion may be based on hadith. Even if it is based on hadith. It's not necessarily, a fatwa is not necessarily the outcome that is spouted out of hadith. Even if we assume that's based on hadith, still issuing a fatwa is not narration of hadith. Furthermore, a fatwa could be based on Quran, it could be based on rational reasons, it could be based on calculations of prudence, and it doesn't have to be necessarily based on hadith. However, even if when it's based on hadith, issuing a fatwa is not narration of hadith. Therefore, a mufti, per its definition, is not the same as narrator of hadith. Okay, let me show you some texts from the books of our scholars, and inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala, I will try to be brief and not go in greater details. This is the book of Al-Dhari'a ila Usul al-Sharia, written by Al-Sharif al-Murtada, published by Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, Foundation in Qom. Here we go, page number 381. Says Al-Sharif al-Murtada, Sayyid Murtada goes as follows. There's a distinction, there's a difference between mufti, a person who issues fatwa, wal mukhbir al-wahid, and a person who is a singular narrator. A narrator and mufti, they are two different people. إن المفتي أن يجب أن يختص بشروط. The mufti, he has to be qualified, and he has to carry certain conditions. Amongst them is ijtihad. A narrator doesn't have to have those conditions. مثل أن يكون من أهل الاجتهاد ولا يجب مثل ذلك في الخبر الواحد. Furthermore, والمفتي يخبر عن نفسه والمخبر الواحد يحكي عن غيره. Mufti doesn't quote anybody else. Mufti is quoting himself. Mufti is merely expressing and stating his own idea, his own opinion, his own position. On the other hand, a narrator, he is narrating, he's quoting another individual. So there's a great distinction between the two. This is quite clear, this matter, that a narrator and a mufti and a mujtahid, they are two different people. This is Bayan al-Usul, written by Lutfullah al-Safi al-Gulpayagani. He is one of the maraja in Qom, and he is the senior most marja today alive. He is, as far as age goes, he's more senior than any other marja. Perhaps he's over 100 years old. If not 100, then indeed he is close to be 100 years old. A very frail man, aged individual. Volume number 2 of Bayan al-Usul. Let's go to page number 197. وبالجملة فرق بين المحدث الذي شغله تحمل الحديث والتحديث وبين المجتهد والمفتي والفقيه الذي من شأنه الإفتاء. There is a clear distinction between a mujtahid and a muhaddith. A muhaddith, a narrator of hadith, his profession, his job, his specialization is to learn hadith and then inculcate and then propagate and then transmit that hadith. So he learns hadith and then he transmits that hadith, and then he teaches that hadith. Whereas if mujtahid min sha'nihi al-ifta, a mujtahid, he issues a fatwa. Furthermore, if he goes, and this portion here that I've highlighted, page 198, furthermore, he goes into greater detail and says, if a narrator dies or he loses his mind, his hadith doesn't become invalid. If we heard a hadith today from this individual and he was alive, and the next day he passed away, or the next day he became crazy, he lost his senses, that hadith that he transmitted when he was alive and that hadith which he transmitted when he was of sound mind, that hadith doesn't become invalid. That remains valid. That retains all its legitimacy forever. However, a fatwa is not as such. A mujtahid, when he dies, his fatwa become invalid. Or if a mujtahid loses his senses, if a mujtahid loses one of the attributes, one of the conditions that are required in him, such as adala, such as having an upright character, if he loses that, then his fatwa become invalid. That is not true in the case of a mujtahid. In the case of a narrator today, when he is transmitting hadith, he is of upright character, he's a truthful person, he is a very reliable individual, and he is alive, and he is intelligent and sane. Tomorrow, he either dies or becomes insane, or loses his adala and becomes corrupt. The narration that he narrated while he was fine, when he had those characteristics, does not become invalid, and this is as opposed to ijtihad. Therefore, there's a clear distinction between a mufti and a narrator. So they are not two different things. And the Imam alayhi salam, in the letter that we discussed in the speech number 16, with regard to Taqlid, is talking about narrator, not about mujtahid. And if he had wanted to speak about mujtahideen, he could have. However, the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam ordered us to refer to muhaddithin, to narrators of a hadith, not mujtahideen. And if Imam alayhi salatu wasalam tells you to go to Mecca, if you decide to go to Medina instead, of course, you have deviated from the command of the Holy Imam alayhi salam. And quite clearly, the Imam alayhi salam says, you have to go to muhaddithin, فَارْجِعُوا فِيهَا إِلَى رُوَاةِ حَدِيثِنَا. And if you decide to rather deliberate with the jurists and follow their fatwa instead of getting hadith from muhaddithin, that is a deviation from the hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam. So, narrators are not jurists. Jurists are not narrators, not necessarily so. So that's established. Let's move on. And if you have a point, if you have a question, or if you have criticism or refutation, you're welcome to write it in the comments while I'm giving this speech, and then inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala I'll answer to your question. Let's go. Move on to the next subject. Next subject is one of the key and most fundamental premises for the validity of taqlid is this claim by mujtahideen that understanding hadith is not feasible for the common man. The common Shia cannot understand hadith. And since he has to follow the rulings of Islam and he cannot understand hadith, and that's not possible for him because that's so difficult, that requires decades of expertise in the seminaries. Therefore, he has to, the words of mujtahideen are hujjah for him. Fatwa of mujtahideen, he has to follow the fatwa of mujtahideen. And it's assumed the fatwa of mujtahideen are understandable, they are readily understandable by the common man, and hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam is not understandable. We will inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala analyze this claim, and we will evaluate this premise. Is it true? Because if it's untrue, you can, if it's proven that you can understand the hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, and you can know what Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam have said, and it's not required that you spend decades in order to do that in the seminaries, then it follows that why should we do taqlid, right? It follows why we should not follow the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam. That would make sense. That question rises right away. There's also another premise that's equally important for the mujtahideen in order to legitimize taqlid, and that is there's a lot of lies in hadith. A hadith, some of them are credible, and many of them are not credible, and they're mixed up. So there's no way a common person, he can distinguish between those hadith which are reliable, which are truly transmitted by the holy Imams alayhim as-salam, and those ahadith which are fabrications, which are not reliable. Therefore, because of books of hadith not being reliable, because they contain all sorts of hadith that are valid, hadith that are not valid, hadith that are true, hadith that are fake. Therefore, for a person who cannot make distinction between these different types of hadith, when he starts reading hadith and he starts following hadith, often he would be following a wrong path. Often he would be obeying a wrong commandment, which will destroy his life, which will at least, or destroys his spiritual life. He doesn't know, and his rituals are invalid because he's following the wrong types of hadith. He doesn't know, and he's not gaining the pleasure of God. And God is, in fact, angry at him because he's doing exactly the opposite of what God asked him to do. Why? Because he opened the books of hadith, and there are all sorts of hadith, and he has happened to be practicing a hadith which is fake or which was transmitted during taqiyya, and this person doesn't understand that it was issued in the condition of taqiyya. Especially so, there are so many unreliable hadith. So we'll discuss about that. And also another premise that there are contradictions amongst a hadith, and you won't know as a common Shia what to do. But let's go first to the first topic and discuss that. Are hadith understandable by the common man? Is it possible? And since this speech is in English, we will assume that we are talking about a person, a common Shia, who doesn't know Arabic, who doesn't know Farsi, who doesn't know, let's say, Urdu, and he knows English only, and he can read English, he can understand English. Is it possible for him to understand hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam? Those preachers and those religious speakers who want to convince you of the legitimacy of taqlid, they will tell you, no, hadith is not understandable for you. Yes, it would be understandable for you if you go to the Hawza, the seminary, and spend a few decades there. Even then, it's possible that you do not understand hadith because only mujtahideen, they can understand hadith, and only they have the qualifications to extract. That's the term they use, extraction. So as if the meanings, the rulings, they are hidden behind hadith, and they have to really squeeze the hadith and extract those rulings out of them. So only they can extract these rulings from them. So that is a very difficult process. And so no, right now you cannot do that. As long as you are an English speaker who doesn't understand Arabic, and even after learning Arabic, there are so many other sciences. Now, you don't just have to learn Arabic, you have to get something equivalent to a PhD in Arabic. And then you have to get PhD in so many other sciences, others different. And then perhaps it's possible, but not guaranteed, that you will be able to understand hadith. So is that so? Is that the case? That is very ludicrous, and that is very, very ignorant, and very unfortunate that all these types of different falsehoods have become facts in Shia religion and the Shia pulpit and the Shia organizations. these are misstatements. These are misleading statements that are not true. Let me give you an example of what is the alternative, according to these preachers, to following the hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim assalam. According to them, the alternative is that you follow the fatwa of Mujtahid. So the fatwa of Mujtahid is readily available in English. You read that book of fatwa. There are websites that contain fatwa, verdicts. There are questions and answers. There are books written in the form of questions and answers. So you can understand. If sometimes the English could be difficult, there are certain terms that you do not understand, but there's always a glossary at the end of the book. You could refer there and you could learn, you could understand. And then there are classes you could attend in a local mosque or online. There are videos in which people explain different fatwas of different mujtahids that you can follow. So this could be done according to them. This problem doesn't exist for you if you are not a mujtahid, if you don't have a PhD in Arabic, and if you don't have a PhD in 10 other sciences. So that then you can follow Islam. So it seems like the only way, according to them, to follow Islam, follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam, is to follow the rulings of mujtahids. Because, of course, getting 10 PhDs is not feasible for everyone, right? And this, if the question that rises here, and one must address, is if that is the case, if that is indeed the case, that Imams alayhim as-salatu was-salam, as divine representatives, as guides of the divinity on earth, to guide us until the day of judgment to the right path, if that were the case, and considering the fact that they knew that there will be a time of occultation, that people would not have direct access to the Holy Imam alayhi salam, or even during the time, before the time of occultation and the presence of the Holy Imams alayhi salam, when not everybody had direct access to the Holy Imam alayhi salatu wasalam, why? Is there any evidence? The Holy Imams alayhi salam said so, that our words are so difficult that you need 10 PhDs in order to understand our words. Did they at any time say to a person that since our words are not accessible, are not understandable for you, they're not fathomable for you, and the questions of halal and haram, you should refer to this person, his words of hujjah for you. So why there's no such evidence in hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, if that is indeed the case? And this is a question that rises with respect to the Imam of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam, because this taqlid is not something minor. And the assumption that Allah sent his emissaries, his deputies, that we have to follow. However, we cannot follow them. He sent them, he ordered us to follow them, and he will condemn us to fire of hell if we do not follow them. Yet we cannot follow them because their words are so difficult. Why? Their words are so difficult. Why would they speak in such a difficult way? That in order to gain a knowledge of their word, you have to extract. That's the term they use, mujtahid, extract. To extract the ruling from out of their words. Why is so difficult? This itself is the answer to this question of difficulty to understand of hadith, that it cannot be true. If Shia ism indeed a religion that's sent by Allah, that's sanctioned by Allah, and this is indeed the only pathway that God Almighty has legitimized for mankind to follow, it cannot be the case that its leaders speak in words, speak in ways that you need 10 PhDs in order to understand them. especially when they were at a time when most people didn't have any literacy at all. Look at our Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There was hardly any person who could read and write in Mecca or Medina. And nobody ever complained to the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, your words are so difficult, so up in the air. We do not understand. What are you saying? Nobody said that to him. Nobody said something like that to our holy Imams alayhim assalam. They never complained. You look at the books of hadith, there's no complaint to them at all ever that, oh Imam, you're so holy, you're so knowledgeable, your words are so difficult. Nobody understands what you're talking about. We don't understand. No, not even once. Not even once. There are ahadith, which says sa'abun mustas'ab. Sa'abun mustas'ab will come inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala. Sa'ab means difficult. Mustas'ab means very difficult. Our words are difficult, very difficult. But that doesn't mean because they're difficult because we do not understand their meaning. There are certain ahadith which are hard to accept. They refer to those ahadith. Difficulty to accept them, not difficulty to understand them. You can understand them very well, but their meaning is such that there is a difficulty in accepting them because there may seem a contradiction with other tenets of religion or with other ahadith. So it will be difficult, or it may not really sit properly in your heart. Your heart will have a hard time accepting that hadith. There are hadith as such, and holy Imams alayhim as-salam have warned us about such a hadith, and they're not wrong. And they've told us what to do about those ahadith. So, but even those ahadith, inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala, we'll talk about them and I'll show them the text to you. They are not talking about any hadith that is difficult to understand or they're difficult to accept. So this assertion that the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam are difficult, so much so that you need so many PhDs to understand them, It's so wrong, so obviously wrong, because we know for a fact, you as an English speaker, if words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, if you are a Shia, you're listening to me, you have heard many hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Not in Arabic, perhaps in Arabic, but they have been translated for you. And because you have heard the translation, you understand the hadith. You know if they're translated to you, you will understand them too. If they're difficult, if they're explained to you, you would understand them. And that is required of you. It's obligatory for you. According to Mujtahideen themselves, they say it's haram to do taqlid and usul al-din. It's haram to take any person's word for granted. Any person's word as its face value, if he's not an infallible, even if it's infallible. And usul al-din. So you have to have reasons to follow, to accept usul al-din. You have to have sound arguments in usul al-din. And a vast area of usul al-din. Their arguments are only in forms of narration. For instance, Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam are 14 individuals. There are 12 imams. They are ma'soom. They're appointed by Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Rather, they're appointed by Allah. And their imamah has been declared by Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam is indeed the first successor, first heir to the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. How do we know all of this? How you, as an English-speaking Shia who doesn't know Arabic, nor has any PhD in Arabic or PhD in the various sciences taught in the Hawza and jurisprudence or principles of jurisprudence. You don't have. You cannot open. If they give you Usul al-Kafi, if I give you Usul al-Kafi, read it for me, you would probably start from the left side because you think, like any English book, it's left to right. Perhaps you'll make that mistake. However, even you are required, it's obligatory on you to know the Imam of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. And how would you know Imam of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam? Because Hadith al-Ghadir, Hadith al-Wilaya, because of the miracles of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, miracles of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, a hadith about the 12 Imams alayhi salam. They have been narrated and they are true and you understood them, therefore you embraced them. Therefore you believe in them. Therefore you have faith in them. Not faith without any proofs, faith with solid certitude. So that is clear. That can happen only if you can understand hadith. That can happen only if you can understand hadith. If you cannot understand hadith, how could you know there are 12 imams, there are not 20 imams? You can't. Only because you can understand hadith. And how did you understand this hadith or these ahadith, these traditions? How did you understand them? How did you come to believe in them? How they underpin your faith, your certitude with regard to Shia tenets of faith, with regard to usul al-din? How do they substantiate your usul al-din? How? Because you don't read Arabic, you don't cannot read usul al-kafi, you cannot read kitab al-hujjah of al-kafi. How? Because you read the translation of these ahadith, and you read the exegeses of these ahadith, and because you heard reliable speakers, trustworthy teachers who would not lie to you, who transmitted these ahadith to you, narrated these ahadith to you, and gave interpretation, sound interpretation, that you found them logically and rationally acceptable and convincing. And therefore, you understood these ahadith, and you attested to their veracity, to their truthfulness, and embraced them, and they underpin and they support your iman, your faith in Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. So the premise that people cannot understand hadith is obviously wrong, obviously false. And there's no refutation to this. This is quite obvious. Yes, if you say that I, as an English-speaking Shia who doesn't have a PhD in Arabic, who doesn't even read Arabic, let alone a PhD in Arabic, I cannot read the original works of hadith. That is true. That is true. But it doesn't mean I cannot understand hadith, even if it's explained to me, even if it's translated in a proficient manner to me. That is wrong. I can understand hadith. And as a matter of fact, you, jurists, you say it's my obligation to understand those ahadith that pertain to usul al-din. So therefore, it could be understood. Now, is there a difference? Is there a difference between usul al-din and furu' al-din? In usul al-din, where certitude is required, where definiteness is obligatory, we can rely on a translation and an exegesis of hadith that is reliable, that's not subject to question, that is not subject to doubt, that is trustworthy. But in furu' ad-din and rulings of Islam, we cannot. What matters is that we follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam never said that you can follow us only and only if you learn Arabic first, right? In beliefs and in action, doesn't matter. We have to follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. We have to obey Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. We have to be on their path. Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam never said that you have to learn Arabic. And you have to not only learn Arabic, but have something that's equivalent to a PhD in Arabic. And PhD in many other sciences too, in order to follow us. That is absurd. That is not true. So just like in faith, in usul al-din, I can follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And I do follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. It's obligatory upon me to follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And how do I do that? I do that because I have the text of these hadiths translated into English and explained in English. And they are convincing. Therefore, I've embraced those ahadith. Likewise, the same can be done in furu' ad-din. The same could be done in furu' ad-din and rulings of Islam. If ahadith are translated, of course, I cannot read usul al-kafi, furu' al-kafi in Arabic, books of hadith in Arabic. That's not possible for me because I don't know Arabic. But if these ahadith are translated to me, translated for me, and not just any translation, a translation that's trustworthy, a translated that has been reviewed, a translated that has footnotes, explanations, and various people attest to its veracity, to its exactitude, that this is quite an accurate translation, then there's no reason why I cannot understand hadith. If I cannot understand such a book of hadith that has been translated into English, and fluent English, and its accuracy has been reviewed by various reliable scholars, and they have testified that this is a good translation, and there are footnotes therein that explain these hadith, and if I'm fortunate, there are other versions of the same hadith translated in different manner, different wordings, which help me understand the wordings of the Imam alayhi salam, which help me understand the hadith. So there is no reason I cannot understand. Now, let's go to fatwa of mujtahid. I don't have a PhD in Arabic. I don't even read Arabic, right? Yet my marja, whom I supposed to follow, and the person who extracts, rulings from hadith, right? This person, the extractor of rulings, he doesn't speak English. He doesn't write in English. He writes in what language? He writes in Arabic, right? So how do I follow him exactly? I follow him in this manner. If you go to ask the Shia preachers today, they will say, okay, you follow him because his book has been translated into English. Look, I have his book. His book has been translated in English. He has also a book of question and answer in English. He has a website too. This is his book. Go read it. This is the book of question and answer. Go read it. And this is his website. There are lots of rulings there. You can go and refer and read them closely. You will understand them, right? You read English. You'll say, yes, I can read this. I'll try to understand. And then they say, if you have any problems, come and ask me. So you go open that book that has written various rulings, opinions of that jurist, and you try to understand that. And why you follow that translation? You trust that translation because you've been told that translation is a good translation. That's accurate. And why that book of question and answer, which is a translation, why you trust it? Because you're told that this is a good translation, this trustworthy translation. And you go, whenever you have a problem, you go to this local alim, local scholar, and he explains to you that the mujtahid, by this text, by this fatwa, he means this, and he doesn't mean that. So that's how you can follow him. Now, why this cannot be done with regard to hadith? As far as understanding hadith is concerned, now they have another assumption. They say the hadith, there are so many wrong hadith mixed into them, right? We'll address that, because it's possible to write a book of hadith that all of its hadith are valid. Is it not possible? Is it not possible for mujtahideen who have so much immense amount of knowledge, who are extractors, who extract rulings from hadith, just like you extract something, the juice out of an orange, they extract. They squeeze out the ruling out of hadith. Is it not possible for them? They spent 70 years in Hausa, generation after generation. How come they claim they're narrators of hadith? How come they have not been able to write a single book of hadith that contains true hadith, right? That contains valid hadith. So we will leave that question aside. So we assume that if there were a book of hadith that are reliable, written by a reliable scholar, whether that could be done or not, inshallah, we'll talk about that. Now, why I cannot understand hadith? So this is very, very stupid assertion. The assertion that you cannot understand hadith. Remember that. The assumption, the premise that you need 40 years to understand, to sit in the house and read in the house in order to, this is wrong. This is not true. This is absurd. This is totally false. And inshallah, tabarak wa ta'ala, I'll bring more evidence tomorrow for you. And I'll explain to you through the books of mujtahideen themselves that they have time and again asserted that people can understand hadith. people can understand. Even a person who's illiterate, who cannot read and write, he can understand hadith. There's no prerequisite of 40 years of studying in house and getting 10 PhDs in order to understand hadith. You as an English speaker, you as a Westerner living in the West, or an immigrant to the West who was born from families who are immigrants, who does not speak Arabic and does not speak Farsi or Urdu, and certainly does not have 7 PhDs in different Islamic sciences, you can understand hadith. You can understand hadith. And yes, you will not be able to read books of hadith in Arabic. I agree with that. But it's not necessary to read books of hadith in Arabic in order to follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. As long as you're following their words, their instructions, if those instructions are translated for you in English, so be it. As long as you're doing that and those instructions are reliable, you can follow. Now, promoters of Taqlid would say, oh, you're doing Taqlid of the translator. You're doing Taqlid of the translator. That's not true. Because Taqlid is what? Taqlid is when you take the word of a person as the law of Islam. As the opinion of a person as the law of Islam. Here I'm taking hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. That has been translated in a trustworthy manner, attested by other people. And any moment, if I have good reasons to doubt the accuracy of that translation, I'll abandon that. I'll abandon the translation and go find another scholar, a reliable scholar, and ask him, this translation seems fishy. I have serious doubts about this translation. Please show this to me. So there's no taqlid of translator, the interpreter who translated the text from Arabic to English, the hadith from Arabic to English, and explained it to me. I'm not doing his taqlid. I'm following the word of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. On the same token, when I take the book of rulings of a mujtahid in English, and I act according to that book of ruling, I'm not doing taqlid of the translator, am I? No, I don't care about the translator's opinion. I don't care about translator's own position. Those are not laws for me. Only because the translation accurately reflects and accurately renders the words of mujtahid into English, I follow them. And any moment I have doubt that this translation looks fishy, at this portion, at this passage, doesn't look reliable, he must have made a mistake, then I don't follow that translation, and I go to my local scholar and say, look, this is the book of ruling of such and such mujtahid. I think there's a mistake here. There's a mistake. So there's no taqlid involved just because it's a translation of a ruling. Taqlid, if I'm a muqallid, right? I do taqlid. If I'm following Ayatollah A, Ayatollah B, Ayatollah C, and I can only follow him if I have his book in English because I do not speak Arabic, that's fine. That's just fine. I still can follow him. But I know English, I have his book in English and I follow his book. I'm not following the translator. Likewise in hadith, same thing in hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. We'll discuss this further inshallah tomorrow, and also we'll discuss the question of contradiction amongst hadith, the question of how we make sure the hadith is true, the hadith is reliable, inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala. These things take time, so more lectures will be necessary. Okay. I am going to answer questions now. Okay. Shia Al goes. Salam Sheikh, yesterday you mentioned there is no hadith to justify Khomeini's baby thawing fatwa. But the scholars argue there is no hadith to forbid this practice, therefore it cannot be called haram to take pleasure from a baby one marries, since he is halal until proven haram. How do you answer this objection from them in justifying Khomeini's fatwa? Is there any hadith which could be used to show that thawing an infant is haram? I have to look it up if there's any specific hadith with that regard. However, anything that's khabith, that's considered khabith, that's considered a despicable act, a reprehensible act by man's nature, by man's وَحَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْخَبَائِثِ, anything that's reprehensible by the heart, by human's heart, that is forbidden in Islam. But however, this specific question does not relate to our topic. Inshallah, I have to look it up. And the hadith, I'm sure there's no hadith that permits thawing, but whether there's a hadith that clearly forbids. So the hadith that mentioned that evil acts that are repugnant to the human nature, to the human conscience, you have to abandon them. Perhaps they could be used at this stage. Okay. Minty goes, Salam Shaykhana, may Allah bless you for your efforts. As always, 2 questions from me. Please, could you comment on the hadith below? Does this call for the use of ijtihad? بل أن الرضا عليه السلام علينا إلقاء الأصول وعليكم التفريع. Okay, علينا إلقاء الأصول. What does it mean? مجتهدين means that مجتهدين say علينا إلقاء الأصول. It's our obligation to transmit principles. That's how they translate this hadith. وعليكم التفريع, and it's your obligation to branch them out, to make different branches, and by that they mean to make different rulings out of this. That's how they interpret this hadith. But that's not the only way to interpret this hadith. The other way to interpret this hadith is usul. First of all, there is no hadith in hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam wherein the word asl has been used to mean principles. You understand? So asl in the older times, whether it meant principle or not, that is a matter of question. That's not proved. So right now, because language changes with the passage of time, now if you say asl, usul, it means principles. But at the times of the holy Imams alayhim as-salatu was-salam, I have not found, and I looked for that, whether asl, usul means principles. I did not find any example for that. What was prevalent at that time? Asl meant books of hadith, book of hadith. So the other way to translate this hadith is alayna ilqa'ul usul. It's our job to dictate. Dictate means what? Dictation. That somebody talks and you write. Ilqa, transmit. Usul, to transmit books of hadith. So dictate, we speak and you write. It's our job that you write books of hadith. وَعَلَيْكُمُ التَّفْرِيعَ. Tafri' means to make branches. Now, these hadith could be on different topics, and you categorize them into different categories of various topics, of various subjects. So that is a meaning that's close, because tafri' also in the times of the holy Imams alayhim as-salam, I did not find any example that the rulings of halal and haram would call at that time furu'. That was not the case. So there's no example for that these words have been used the way that is amenable to mujtahideen's interpretation. So we have to interpret these words as they were at the times of the holy Imams alayhim as-salam. Now, even if this is a very, very valid refutation, which I just mentioned. However, even if we leave that aside and we say it means the same thing as mujtahideen say, so still it doesn't prove ijtihad. It merely says that there are certain hadith which are general principles that have wide applications. Not all hadith. There are certain hadith that have general applications. So there's a hadith that is a general principle that could be applied on various instances. And it's your job to apply them on its own appropriate principles. For instance, كل شيء لك طاهر حتى تعلم أنه قدر. Everything is clean and pure for you until you know it's dirty, it's polluted, it's najis. So, كل شيء لك طاهر. Everything. This hadith, there's no difficulty in understanding this hadith. And you don't have to have 7 PhDs in Arabic, in principles of fiqh, jurisprudence, history, tafsir, everything to understand this hadith. Even if you don't know Arabic, you know English, you can still understand this. You don't have to be mujtahid to act according to this hadith and obey to this hadith. This hadith says what? Even if we accept the interpretation that is conducive to the position of the mujtahideen, which would mean what? We, the holy imams, we give you general principles and you apply them to their own appropriate instances. So, if there's a general principle from the holy imam alayhi salatu wassalam, كل شيء لك مطلق حتى يرد فيه النهي. كل شيء مطلق, everything is permissible until there is a prohibition against it. So anything is, you fly by airplane, is it permissible or not? Yes, permissible, because there is no prohibition in hadith against flying an airplane. To use the email to send a message, it's haram or not? There's no prohibition against it, therefore it's permissible. So you don't even have to know Arabic in order to act according to these hadith, let alone being a mujtahid, okay? And then Minty goes, also, do we accept every hadith within the main Shia hadith books? Like I've read in Kafi and Tafsir Qummi that Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam was asked, on what does the hadith rest? Imam alayhi salatu wasalam said, it rests on the surface of a fish. The earth rests. They asked, on what does the fish rest? He replied, on water. The hadith continues on. So ahadith are true. These ahadith, some ahadith are difficult to understand. It doesn't mean there's a fish the earth rests on, okay? These are in the older astrology and in the times of antiquity, they had certain terminology that they are antiquated now and they are not used now. And there are many stars, and the constellations that they are named after animals, fish or scorpion, and so on and so on and so on. And the earth rests upon these constellations. There is some sort of relationship between them through gravity or whatever we do not understand. And these relationships change between constellations and between the earth, because everything is mobile in the universe. So what is the exact meaning of this hadith of the holy Imam alayhi salatu wasalam? We do not know. As you know, the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam, certainly there's not a big animal, big fish, right? A physical fish that the earth is sitting on top of that, and that fish is sitting on water. Certainly not like that. But there's a meaning of that Imam alayhi salam knows, and the person who was addressed to, he knew. But because these meanings were lost to us, we do not know the exact meaning of these hadith. And just because we do not know the meaning of hadith, we cannot reject that this hadith is true. There are hadith from Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. If a hadith comes to you, and like Sa'ab al-Mustas'ab, right? Oh, hadiths are difficult. Oh, I told you, the difficulty is not about understanding the meaning, it's understanding or the wording of hadith. We understand the wording of hadith, but to find the correct interpretation, accepting that interpretation, that is difficult. So if you encounter such a hadith, you say that I do not understand. Perhaps there was some clues in this hadith that the person who the hadith was addressed to, he knew. And then they were lost, and they have not reached us. Just because I don't understand a dialogue between two individuals over 1,000 years ago, a dialogue between two individuals that its meaning does not make sense to me today. I cannot say that this dialogue did not occur, did not take place. You understand? I don't know many things in the world, but lots of things. People talk among themselves. I do not understand what they're saying. I know what they're saying, but I do not understand what they're saying. So, but I it doesn't mean I did not hear them say those things, right? Same thing here. I hope you understand. So all hadith and Shia books by the holy Imams alayhim as-salatu was-salam, they are not all of the same category in terms of reliability. And all of these hadith are at the peak of veracity from the holy Imams alayhim as-salatu was-salam. However, there is contradiction between ahadith, and the holy Imams alayhim as-salam spoke of those contradictions, and these contradictions were made intentionally by the Imams alayhim as-salam. Intentionally. And why was that? That will come inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala. That was Imams alayhim as-salam intentionally spoke in contradictory manner, and there are contradictory hadith, and the Imams alayhim salam have told us what to do when we see contradiction in their hadith. This will, inshallah, the time comes, I'll explain to you. This cannot be explained in brevity. Okay. And Shaykh, what are the conditions for accepting narration of fiqh? Some say the chain of narration at least. Okay, that's not the time now, okay? That is not the time. What are the conditions for that? Also, do you plan live question answer in English where people may ask question on any topic? So this is a live question answer, isn't it? I think I am giving you a live question answer. Assalamu alaikum. What are your main points of how the Hawza can reform and the way they teach students? Hawza will not reform. It's very difficult, right? You're saying how to reform the Hawza. It is not going to reform. Hawza is going to remain and continue to remain a center of opposition to Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. I've given up the idea. It's like saying, because so much has to change. The leaders, who is going to convert them, right? All the Wahhabis, how we convert them to Shia? That's impossible. Today, there are two types of worst enemies of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. One are it's not Israel, it's not the United States, it's not China, it's not anybody else. It's within the realm of Islam. Those who defend Aisha and Abu Bakr and Umar, they are the worst. And even worse than them are Shia seminaries. They are the hijab between Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam and the people. They're not going to reform. And if you ask me how to do it, I don't know. So much has to change, really. So much has to change. Their mentality is impossible. It's impossible, really. Would they abandon all their heresies? Would they abandon all their heresies and all their heretic ways? No way they're going to abandon that. Are they going to admit that their marji'iyya is not legitimate? I don't see any signs of that. The only way the Hawza would be restored to the path of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam is when the Imam alayhi salam comes. There is no other solution, really. There is no other solution. It's not that their proofs are very, very convincing. It's not that they have very strong arguments on their side. No, it's because they're adamantly and vehemently insist on their wrongs. And anybody who opposes them is accused of being an agent or having an ulterior motive. And because the Shia, they fool the Shia, they mislead the Shia, and they take khums from the Shia, religious dues from the Shia, and the cycle continues. So as long as the khums is coming, they have vast amount of funds, billions of dollars, not millions, billions of dollars. On top of that, Sistani and the son, they sell oil too. From what I've heard, they have this oil that's smuggled out of Iraq. So that's billions and billions of dollars. And what billions of dollars, what they do, they make more madrasas. And those madrasas, they teach what? They train new generations of scholars who would just promote their own way of thinking, their own line of Shiism. So is this cycle going to break? Some people would be awakened and will come out, but not everybody. And this will only the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam when he comes. this, their only solution is something else, practical solution of the Imam alayhi salam. Okay, then he goes, Sayyid Ali goes, do you believe Aqidah in defending the religion against new concepts such as atheism and liberalism should be made priorities to deal with new challenges? Yes, of course, I agree with that. That's a good idea. Can you do a question and answer live stream once? Yes, I can do. I'll do Zoom. Okay, I'll announce Zoom. I should have done today because today is Sunday, right? I should have done it today because most people are not working today. Sunday was a good day to do a Zoom session so you could join me live, audio, video, but I forgot. So next time, probably next Sunday, we'll do Zoom. Or we can do before Sunday also, we can do Zoom. A Zoom session whereby you could discuss, you can talk to me audio and video. So ABC goes, I have very low opinion of Hadith, both Shia and Sunni. The purport Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad as a man, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that was boastful about being better than even Abraham, when Quran is clear that some prophets were. Okay. Now, I don't have an answer to you, ABC, just because of your ignorance, okay? I'm going to ignore what you said. And I do not, this because this is outside of my topic. If it was my topic, the grade of our Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam higher than the other prophets, I would have bothered to answer you. But you are totally out of line and out of subject, so I'm going to ignore you. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. How can a random Shia can understand Hadith which are contradicting each other, and how you can expect to every Shia to reach this level of knowledge? Thank you very much. So contradictory Hadith, as contrary to what you understand, there are not too many. There are a few Hadith that contradict each other. And you do not have to understand them all. You do not have to understand all Hadith. Just like you don't have to know all Hadith that pertain to Usul al-Din, right? Only those Hadith which are required, so you may have certainty, that you may have, you can be definite about your Aqidah, about your beliefs. You have to know those Hadith. Likewise, with regard to halal and haram, you don't have to know all of the Hadith. Only those Hadith pertain to your action. And those Hadith which are contradictory, they are not too many, they are very few. And many of those contradictions are just seeming contradictions. They are not, upon close examination, they are not real contradictions. So, if ulama have abandoned the path of Hadith, right? Ulama have abandoned the path of Hadith. If an alim was writing a book for Shia to follow, for instance, if I were writing a book about how you should pray, or how you should make wudu, or how you should make ghusl, I do not have to bring you the contradicting hadith. I don't have to. That's not necessary, because you don't have to understand. I should bring only those hadith that are free of any contradiction with other hadith. And if I'm pressed to bring two hadith which are seemingly contradictory, I could put a small footnote that this hadith refers to this fact, this hadith refers to this fact, and that's how they do not contradict each other. And if those two hadith are such that their contradiction cannot be resolved, the holy Imams alayhim salam said, if the contradiction between two hadith cannot be resolved, and they're equally reliable, you can act according to any one of them, according to each one of them. It's your choice. So at that time, I could quote both hadith and tell you the contradiction is such, and there are not too many hadith as such. The contradiction of hadith is such that you may act according to either one. And believe me, the complexity that you have in fatwa and verdicts of mujtahideen are way more than contradiction between ahadith. Complexity of fatwa are immense. the nuances that you see in fatwa, the complicated ahadith. Ihtiyat wajib is this, but you have to do this, and this condition is this. Only jinn can remember all that stuff, right? Very difficult to remember. Difficult. Understanding them is difficult. Remembering them is almost impossible. Fatwa are very complex. So ahadith is a lot simpler than fatwa. And the contradiction that you're referring to, you do not have to learn all of them. Simple, common Shia, they do not have to learn all of them. It's the duty of ulama when they're narrating hadith that they narrate those ahadith which are free of contradiction, or if there's indeed a contradiction, show how they are compatible, these two hadith, and the contradiction is only superficial and not substantial. And then if this contradiction cannot be resolved, then explain that also. And you as a Shia can fully understand this. And there's no reason why you shouldn't understand, because there are not too many instances as such. Yes, in the books of hadith, if you want to learn all hadith, yes, then you have more instances. But you don't have to learn all hadith, right? Only those hadith that are relevant to your daily lives, that you have to learn. Okay. Let's go to the next page. My sister goes, Salam alaikum, alaikum salam. Please recommend trusting hadith with English translation for a beginner. Trusting hadith. You mean trustworthy hadith with a translation? I don't know. I don't know any. I'm not really familiar with books in English. Trustworthy books of hadith are Man La Yahdharu al-Faqih, Furu' al-Kafi, Tahdhib Istibsar, Al-Ja'fariyat. All these books are great books of hadith. But have they been translated into English? I do not know. So don't blame me. It's the job of the community, okay? The Shia have abandoned the path of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam for centuries. Now we have to right a wrong that has been going on for centuries, for hundreds of years. So if the solution is difficult, it's not my fault. Don't blame me for that. This solution, if you keep persisting on a wrong path, it doesn't make that wrong right. If you keep persisting on the path of taqlid and marji'iyya, it's not been sanctioned by Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam just because you continue, because it's convenient, because others are doing it. That won't make it right. The path of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, following Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, is difficult because it has been abandoned, because scholars have indeed abandoned serving Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, not now, since centuries. Even in Farsi, when you go, you do not find good translations of hadith in Farsi. Iran, the country, the biggest Shia country speaking Farsi speaking, you do not find too many good translations of hadith, too many good books of exegesis of hadiths. There are some, but not too many. So let alone English. However, it's not something very difficult to be done. It's not impossible to provide good English translations of hadith and reliable and reviewed translation of hadith. It's not impossible, but who is going to do it? Who is going to do it? You Shia give your religious dues to whom? To Maraji. Maraji do not want that. Officers of Maraji do not want you to follow hadith. They will not dig their own graves. Shia scholars don't know hadith. Shia scholars are against hadith. Shia scholars do not want you to follow hadith. So it's a dilemma, and it's not my doing. I didn't cause it. I'm trying to find a solution. Don't blame me. Okay. May Allah bless you all. Brother goes, love from Germany to a role model and beloved Sheikh. who defends Shiism and fights for truth. May Allah bless you. Thank you, brother, from Germany. Ryu goes, Salam Sheikh Ahlul Bayt TV are currently doing a live question and answer. You can call. Don't, please, 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 don't propose these ideas to me. Then why should I call them? You call them if you like talking to them. I thought you were a smart guy. Because these people don't talk to me. No, the Shia scholars would not speak with me, right? They get scared. All of them get scared when talking to me. Okay. So, I don't think there's any question remaining that I didn't answer. May Allah bless you all. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma kun li waliyika al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan. Salawatuka alayhi wa ala aba'ih. في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا طويلا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم الشريف. May Allah bless you all. May Allah keep you well. We will see you another day with the help of Allah, inshallah.
शहीदों की जो माए हैं फरिश्तों का सलाम उन पर जवाब आई कि मैयत से जो बहने लिख